We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
Go on without me. Just go.
A good soldier never leaves a man behind.
Because I wouldn't give you 2 cents for all your fancy rules if behind them they didn't have a little bit of plain, ordinary, everyday kindness.
Life finds a way.
Well, this is the episode where you either crack no jokes or you crack the worst jokes constantly.
Yeah. And I'm not that guy.
Jeff and I will take different positions on that.
I'm a little torn on that myself for this movie. It's like, I'm not saying I would do that, but like, there's no middle ground. You either got to go and commit to it and make it work.
Yeah.
Like, my opinion on dark humor is that everything's permissible if it's funny.
Right. No,
Yeah.
If it's not funny, though, then then you're a douchebag.
Yeah, the most offensive thing about off-color jokes is when they're not very good.
Right. I mean, like, now you're just cool for no reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we've got our intro.
All right. I might leave some of that in. Welcome to Silver Screen Biases, where we dig into a critically acclaimed movie and evaluate the truth claims within it. I'm Nelson.
This is Jeff.
And this week we're joined by Jacob Daniel Winograd of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. We're so excited to have you, and we've got some questions for you as a first-time guest. I think based on the name of the podcast that you host, some of these will already be given away. But to start us off, Jeff.
What is your political bias, Jacob?
Well, I mean, I could use the cop-out answer and say that my political bias is being Christian and being committed to the kingdom of God. But obviously, I mean, if we're talking about political systems, I would say I obviously lean towards libertarian anarchism. I would also just plant my flag as an anarcho-capitalist. I used to kind of be that little middle-of-the-ground anarchist and be like, oh, we can get along with the ANCOMs and the lip socks, but I don't know, I've become a little bit more black-pilled on the left anarchists as of late. I mean, there's some good ones, but they're far and few between. But yeah, I mean, generally libertarian, Ron Paul style, Austrio anarchist.
Okay.
Before you get to the second question,
Yes.
Now I've been listening to you on a few of your different podcasts and appearances on other podcasts for a while, and you've mentioned before that you had a bit of a path to libertarianism, and you were actually at one point you considered yourself like a Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist. Is that right?
Oh yeah, yep.
And was it a moment that switched you, or was it kind of a progression that brought you towards free market libertarianism?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a progression. Like, there was like 3 or 4 key moments that all accumulated into the transition that I went from sort of like Bernie Sanders anti-war leftist to anti-war anarcho-capitalist. I mean, I think Trump's election was the catalyst, because after Trump was elected, the left went just completely off the rails and started caring way more about things that I didn't care about anymore, like wokeism and everything Trump was doing. And even though I didn't like Trump, it was clear that the media was just lying about him constantly. Yeah. So I sort of left my left circles because I just didn't fit in there anymore. I was more of just a moderate, and I was kind of politically homeless during that time. And then I think I was shown some debates by some conservative friends of mine of Ben Shapiro and Cenk Uygur on universal healthcare, because that was like Bernie Sanders leftists, like anti-war is one of the things that we've always cared about. But then, think about like people like Glenn Greenwald and whatnot, or Jimmy Dore, their big thing on top of being anti-war is always universal healthcare. That's definitely where I was. I was always a universal healthcare kind of guy.
Right.
And although there's a lot of things about Ben Shapiro I don't like, he did make a very solid libertarian free market critique of universal healthcare, which I hadn't really heard before. Made me more open to hearing people from the right side of the aisle and their economic views, and maybe considering some of my views were wrong. And then I joined like a local political discussion meetup group that just happened to feature a lot of like Mises Caucus style libertarians. So I started getting introduced to people like Dave Smith and Tom Woods and watching their shows. And so being more introduced to libertarian arguments. And then I was given the audiobook Freedom by Adam Kokesh back before he had his infamous meltdown over the past year or so. But that book is actually, I would still recommend that book to any former lefty, because it's sort of like attacking the left from the left. And so a lot of my, still at the time, very, left-leaning sentiments and his style of argumentation was very attractive and persuasive to me. And that sort of pushed me over the edge after I connected all those different dots.
Now, for a lot of our audience who aren't in the libertarian sphere, like my co-host, for example,
Hello.
A lot of that's going to sound like inside baseball. I strongly recommend you check it out. I'm going to try and link as much of the reference stuff below so that you can look into that yourselves. Now, our second question, Jeff.
Do you have any spiritual biases, or where
Religious
how would you
bias.
describe yourself spiritually or religiously?
Yeah, well, sort of like I joked for the answer to the first question, I'm definitely a Christian.
Yeah.
I actually consider myself a Christian, like in the sense of it's not just a religious affiliation. Like it's not like, oh, I'm just a member of the church, or I use it as a label. It's like I identify personally as like, I look to Jesus as my personal savior. I think that I've been born again in him, and that this isn't my true home, and I'm called to live here to honor God, to take care of my family, but that ultimately my focus is on the kingdom of God. And so that's kind of my perspective in terms of my Christian faith and beliefs. I don't just go to church and sing songs every Sunday, and it's not, and it's more than just that. Like I always hate that cliche. Like it's not religion, it's relationship. It's like, no, it's even deeper than that. It's like it really is to me like my entire life, and everything in my life is informed by my belief in the truth of the revelation in the scriptures and in the life of Jesus Christ.
Cool.
I'm curious, that depth of commitment, is there any correlation in time period with your political alignment, or would you say that you were similarly religiously committed and devoted while you were also more identifying with the political left?
No, actually, I would say as my political views developed, my faith also deepened. I mean, I've never lost my faith. I've always been a Christian, but I think I had, when I was a child, I thought like a child, and now as a bigger child, I think like a bigger child. So, but yeah, I think my faith and my political views sort of developed hand in hand, and honestly, like everything I've done in the work that I've done has actually been trying to reconcile those things, because I don't want to live my life compartmentalized. I don't want to have different hats. I want to be consistent, whether I'm engaging in religious dialogue, political dialogue, social dialogue. I want to have one cohesive worldview.
Yeah. Speaking of worldview, third question: what's your favorite movie, and/or genre movies, category movies?
Yeah, picking favorites is really, really hard. I mean, like, if I was going to pick a standalone movie, it would have to be something like either the movie we're talking about today, because it holds deep personal significance for me, that being Schindler's List. But if I was going to pick, like, some movies I really love, but I love them in the broader context of those series or sagas. Like, I think Star Wars is probably like my favorite franchise within, movie media and things like that. Not that there haven't been low points, but there's the overall message and thematic imagery of like the light side and the dark side, and the struggle between those two. And then even as I've grown older, there's just so many layers to it. Like there's also a lot of political commentary and philosophy that's to be found in the Star Wars franchise. And, it's funny. It's like, as Star Wars has expanded, it's similar to what I said earlier. Like when you first watch Star Wars, it's like everything is simple. It's light side versus dark side. And then you become an adult and you realize, well, life is, there is good and evil, but then life has a lot of this gray, this mushy middle, and this, it can be complex. And Star Wars is sort of expanded in that way too, where it's like, a lot of Star Wars, I mean, you have some like really evil characters, right? Like Darth Sidious and stuff. But a lot of the people are these mixtures of dark and evil, and they do a lot of good and a lot of bad, and they have to, wrestle through those things. And
Right.
so I find that series to be very just a very compelling and informative and entertaining saga.
Yeah, there's definitely depth to it. I'd agree with that. So, any final thoughts that you'd like to add to kind of sum up who Jacob is before we get into this episode?
No, I can't. I mean, it might be worth mentioning before we get into the movie that I also have a why the movie will have deep significance to me is that I have, although I was not raised religiously Jewish, and I'm not technically Jewish because my mother's not Jewish, I'm very connected to my Jewish ancestry. My dad was born Jewish, was a religious Jew who converted to Christianity when he was in his teens, and so did my grandmother. And so I grew up with my grandmother living in our house, and she still practiced like a lot of the Jewish feasts and Passover and Hanukkah and things like that. She had Jewish prayer Bibles that she would read with me. And so I was very connected to that. And so when I started to learn about things like the Holocaust and other things, those things in history definitely impacted my development as a person.
For sure.
In terms of, opposing injustice and tyranny and collectivism and being anti-war and all that, and also just having a part of my identity is also trying to contemplate my sort of like Jewish ancestry. So I think that's relevant.
Awesome.
One thing I'd like to say,
I'll allow it,
is that when I invited Jacob on to discuss Schindler's List, I was not aware he was Jewish. I'm very bad at recognizing name origins. And when I told a friend of mine that we're having Jacob Daniel Winograd, a host of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, on, he's like, "Did you seriously invite a Jewish guy on to discuss Schindler's List?" And I was like, "I don't know. Maybe. I'll have to ask him."
Time will tell.
Yeah, we'll find out.
Winograd is actually Russian for grape, but it's a common like Rush because my family came from like Polish, like depending on what year it was either Poland or Russia, like right on the border.
Okay.
So my I always forget if it's my great or my great grandfather. I'm always bad at remembering that. I think it was my grandfather's grandfather. So that's 4 greats, I think. But him and his literally 9 brothers, all fled Poland at the same time due to like rising anti-Semitism and things like that. And only 3 of them made it out. A couple of them went to Europe, and then one, my grandfather's grandfather, made it to America. And this was before World War II and all that, but it was like the rising tensions and things like that. So, I know more about my dad's side. But I know my dad's grandfather's side. I don't know much about my dad's mother's side, but I know that their last name was Goldsmith. And so when I go to I've been to the Holocaust Memorial and looked at records and stuff, and I can find both last names, in the records of people who, both survivors and those who suffered at the hands of the Nazis or even of Stalin and stuff. So it's I don't know anyone personally. I don't have any deep connection that way, but it's still one of those things. It's like when I hear that story, I have like pictures of my grandfather's grandfather, and I've heard stories about them throughout my whole life growing up. And there was always something when you hear about that when you're young, you're like, wow, like if they hadn't done that, I either wouldn't be here or I would be living in incredibly different circumstances than I do now.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
It's very impactful.
Before we jump into this, because I'm already loving this conversation. Can I give some stats on the movie here?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's, because we haven't really introduced the movie yet. So we are talking about Schindler's List, 1993, directed by Steven Spielberg. This is the first time we've done back-to-back directors.
That's right.
Last episode we did Jaws, so this week is Schindler's List. The movie is 3 hours and 15 minutes long.
Yeah. Longest movie we've covered by far.
It is rated R. And some notable cast is Liam Neeson, Ralph Fiennes, and Ben Kingsley.
Yep.
And just give some of the stats as far as ratings and stuff go. It is 9.0 on the out of 10 on IMDb. Number 6 in the top 250. This is the highest rated movie we've done so far.
That's right. And in 1999, it was number 2.
Ooh, so it's been up there. Okay. In Rotten Tomatoes, it's 98% tomato meter and 97% audience. Then I want to give the budget facts, and then I have one question, and then we can get into the meat and bones of this. The budget for this movie was $22 million in 1993.
Yeah.
What does that equate to today?
Well, in the last 30 years, there's been 108% cumulative rate of inflation, so that's $45.8 million.
That's not a lot for a movie.
It's not a lot for a movie. No. I think they saved a lot of money on the color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The scale of this movie is huge, though.
Yeah.
Like this felt like a big movie as far as just the breadth of and the width of geographically, and just like there was different, like just it felt big.
Yeah.
So that's very surprising budget wise.
And they hired
expanse of the movie.
They hired a bunch of historians to verify. So this is based off a book called Schindler's Ark. And they hired a bunch of historians to verify authenticity, to make sure that it was culturally appropriate for the time, not in 1993, but for the time it takes place, to make sure that even the like mannerisms are correct and stuff like that. And actually, the smuggler that Schindler befriends in the Catholic Church,
oh yeah,
the guy that is being portrayed there was actually somebody who helped provide assistance on the production of the movie to make sure its authenticity, which I think is really fascinating.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Final question, then we can get into some of these topics here. Is I'm assuming I know the answer for you, Jacob, but between all three of us, have you guys seen this movie before watching it for the podcast?
It's been 10 years, but I have seen it before.
Okay, and then Jacob, you've seen this multiple times?
Yeah, I think as I watched it Saturday night with my wife, and I think that's the third time I've watched it in my life. I watched it in my high school Holocaust studies class. I watched it again, I don't know, probably like 6-7 years ago, and then I watched it over the last weekend before recording this.
Yeah, this was my first time. And honestly, leading up to this podcast, I thought the movie was older than what it was. 93 seems more recent than what I was thinking this movie was made in. So like, I didn't realize how current this movie had been made and stuff. So yeah, so this was my first time with it.
What did you know going in?
I actually didn't know. I didn't know anything. All I knew was about the Holocaust, and it was super heavy.
Yeah.
So like, I didn't know who Schindler was. I didn't know what the list was. I didn't know. I had no idea. I didn't know. I had no preconceived notions outside of it being during Holocaust. It did meet expectations as far as being super heavy and not a happy watch. So that met expectations, but other than that, I did not know what to expect.
Okay. Jacob, you said earlier that this is your favorite movie. Is that right?
Yeah, if I was going to pick, I mean, it's hard to pick like, this is my favorite movie for me, but I think it's definitely the movie, like if I was going to pick a single standalone movie that's been, I don't know, that sticks out the most in my mind and has impacted me the most, that would probably be it.
One thing that Jeff and I have noticed over this project is that when we're watching a movie specifically to observe worldview, there's things in the movie that speak to us in different ways, and sometimes movies that we've seen 100 times to hit a little bit differently. So did you still enjoy it when you were watching it to analyze it for worldview, or did you not enjoy it as much?
It's really weird to use the word enjoy for this movie, but
Fair.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah.
It is a weird, and so I'm going to answer your question, but just like it's funny, this makes me think of a conversation I had with my wife because she watched it with me, and then yesterday she was like, it's weird. It was like she's like, that was like one of the like, most gut-wrenching movies I ever watched, and it was emotionally draining. She's like, and I kind of want to watch it again, but it's like, and it's one of those weird movies. It's like it's so moving, but it's not exactly a movie. It's not like, it's not something you sit down and watch casually, even though it's a great movie. Like there's so many movies that you can like binge watch, you know what I mean? Like this is not a movie that really fits that. As far as my reaction this time watching it, it's I definitely went in. I don't think I went in like I was sort of, or like I remember the story well enough that I didn't go in expecting to like really have any refreshment other than just like remembering characters and remember like specific plot points that maybe had faded to the background of my memory. but there were so many things that hit both like on a maybe like more surface level, like just like political analysis, just because that's the way my mind works a little bit. But then also just like on a character level analysis now being older, because I think the first 2 times I watched it, I was much younger. Like first time I was probably like 15, and the second time I was probably like 21 or 22. Now I'm 30 and I have 4 kids, and I've seen a lot more. Not that it exactly compares to the Holocaust, but I've also witnessed a lot more tyranny in both our country and in the world globally, and I'm more aware of that. And so, yeah, watching this movie is, I guess I think when I watched it when I was younger, I had this false notion of like, wow, that was horrible. I'm so glad that we've learned from this. And now I watch it and I go, like, I'm almost angry. I'm like, how have we not learned from this? Like, I thought we had, but we really haven't, because it's on so many levels. It's not even because it's easy to focus on the anti-Semitism, right? And I think the movie does a good job capturing that, but it's not even just about anti-Semitism. It's about, prejudice and collectivism, broadly speaking. And it's also about how easy it is. Like the human condition is so easily hijacked by tribalism and nationalism.
Status.
And so but then also there's like but the part that also hit me differently now than I did as a kid was also like the complexity of people, because like Oscar, the main character, like I definitely now as a person who's more mature and more experienced in my adult life, I can see him and appreciate even more his complexity as being a really flawed human being. He's a womanizer. He was definitely in it at the beginning just for money, kind of taking advantage of a situation, but then growing through that. And it's not like he lived his life as a saint even afterwards.
Right.
Like in the post credits, it says his marriage failed. He had failed business ventures. You don't have to. So like one of the things I took away was like, wow, you can be a person who really struggles in life, but still leave this kind of impact, still do that kind of good.
Yeah.
And then also looking at some of the villains, like the main person they focused on was
Voldemort.
What's Voldemort.
Lord Voldemort.
I remember his movie name, like Goth or something.
Eamon Goth, Goeth.
Yeah, Eamon Goth. Yeah,
a real person.
Right. And I'm not like I'm gonna be careful how I say this, but like you're watching his character, and you even notice with him, like even though he's the obvious, like the overt villain they're focusing in on, you even can see in the performance that Ralph gives, you see the complexity to that character and how he is a person who's obviously like not just struggling with his inner demons. His inner demons are out for full display, but you still see those flashes of humanity and that his inner conscience that are in there and that he's struggling with. And so there's just so much to there, but I think watching it this time, I definitely noticed more of the political complexities and implications, and then also more of just the duality of man that each one of us has, that struggle between our inner darkness and light.
Going into this movie, like compared to other historical movies I've watched, I'm not a fan of the movie Titanic, but going to that, watching Pearl Harbor, movies like that, like that are based on historical events, like I was assuming for there to be like fictional storylines, romance story, like to my knowledge, and I don't know much about this time piece, this time era, but like going into this, like this didn't watch like Titanic, like you weren't watching, like I didn't feel like I was watching a fictional character taking place in a historical timeline. Like this felt like I was watching a documentary from front to beginning, from front to end, front to back. There it is. Like, and there was nothing about this that felt entertaining. I was never entertained by this movie. I felt like I was watching an academic, scholarly piece of work.
Yeah, nearly every named character in the movie is a real person that actually existed and we know a lot about, except for I can't remember his first name, but the accountant Stein that Ben Kingsley played. He's an amalgamation of several characters, of several real life people, but nearly everybody else, including Helen Hirsch, the maid for Eamon Goth, almost everybody in the movie, based off a real person that we know a lot about. Helen Hirsch died in 1997. and you actually get to see her in the credits scene where they're putting the rocks on, and they've got the actors next to the person that they're portraying, which I thought was wild.
So emotional.
But yeah, so real people, complex people. Very few people in this movie are portrayed as outright saints. Schindler, for 2/3 of the movie, is not a good man.
No.
And not only is he not a good man, he is visibly uncomfortable when somebody tells him he's a good man.
Right.
One thing that I thought was really fascinating, there's that scene where him and Goth are sharing a drink and smoking, and they're talking about they're making a deal.
Is that when they're outside?
No, they're inside for this scene.
Okay, because there's another scene where he's having a smoke and they're in the train trailers. Or
no, not yet.
This
so
is a different
this is
scene.
earlier.
Okay.
This is about a third of the way through.
Okay.
And Goth has a lot more political power than Schindler does.
Yeah.
A lot more influence, a lot more authority. He commands.
Schindler's a businessman.
Schindler's a businessman.
Essentially a politician.
And Goth is a politician. He controls a bunch of Nazi soldiers.
Yeah.
Could have Schindler killed in a second, and nobody would blink about it,
remorse.
right? Even though Schindler's is part of the Nazi party, Goth could paper over that no problem.
Right.
And yet still we see in that scene that Goth is intimidated by Schindler. And throughout the movie we see not only is he intimidated by Schindler, but he looks up to Schindler, wants to be like Schindler. And Schindler uses that to his advantage, but also to the advantage of the people later. When he says, there's a scene, an interaction between the two of them. I have it written down here. Goth says, "I watch you. You're never drunk. That's real control. Control is power, real power." And Schindler, in his response, says, "Power is when we have every justification to kill and we don't." And then the next scene is Goth showing a significant change in his temperament. I mean, he still kills that kid, but he kills one person when normally he would have killed 5.
Many, yeah.
So...
Yeah. No, that was definitely an interesting display of, like I was mentioning earlier, that like duality of man, even someone evil like Goth. And yeah, the other thing that was really like you brought up the Oscar not liking being called a good man by other people. And I mean, I think you're right. Like that first like third or half of the movie, like he's kind of just this. He's not the antagonist, but he's not like someone you're necessarily rooting for.
Yeah.
Right.
Then like that scene, where that woman kind of like disguises herself a little bit, uses a fake name to get in and like say, "Listen, I've heard no one dies here, and this place is a safe haven. You're a good man, and please, will you bring my grandparents here?" And then he gets angry at her, yells at her. Then he goes and talks to and he's like, "I know what you're doing. You're going around and you're trying to bring people here who really aren't productive, and like you're going to get me in trouble and all that." And he's like yelling, making a big deal out of it. And then at the end, of all of that, he still goes and writes down their names, gives it to him, and I think gave him like a watch or something to sell, to pay for it or something.
Well, I will say in that scene, because he defends Goth in that scene to Stein.
Right.
And one of the things he says is, let me see, because I wrote it down. "War brings out the worst in people. Never the good, always the bad. Always the bad."
Right.
And he's trying to tell Stein, no, like, Goth in other circumstances, he'd be a good guy. Stein says, well, actually, he murders people just for fun. And that's when Schindler says, okay, well, here's the names of the people I need.
Yeah.
I think that so as much as Schindler manipulates Goth through the movie, Stein manipulates Schindler for the first 2/3 of the movie. And the I think that Schindler's own depravity doesn't hit Schindler until like the last 5 minutes of the movie.
They're definitely, all three of the main characters you just talking about are definitely out for like self gratification. Like all three of them have intentions of the way they're talking, the way they're making choices, so that all three of them can make the best choice that benefits them the most. Like they're all playing this game of like, how can I win whether you win or lose?
Right. And for Stein, what winning looks like is saving as many people as possible.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a weird, like, it's not I don't know if manipulate's even the right word. It's kind of like, I mean, it is in like a, the broadest sense of the word. It's a manipulation, but it's kind of like I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's like I don't know, I think he knows that Schindler, although he's not a great man, is not evil. But he also knows, like, he's sort of like riding that fence. And so he's basically like, he's giving him opportunities, giving him like challenges and being like, listen, like, here's what's going on. Here are the facts. Here are your options. Which way are you going to choose? And it's, he definitely like puts Oscar in very uncomfortable situations, and it is kind of manipulation, but it's also like, I don't know. It to me, it's kind of analogous, just to speak religiously here. It's kind of, I think, what God does to us in our lives. Like we hit points in our life where we have, clear forks in the road where it's like, well, we're struggling. We have our selfish ambitions that we're dealing with and our own plans, but we hit a point where it's like, all right, well, which way are we going to go? What are we going to do? And it doesn't mean that we choose the right thing easily, but we still have to make that choice. Like Schindler could have decided to, like Pharaoh, he could have hardened his heart.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the Schindler, like he still hasn't at this point transitioned into, more of the hero he's going to transition to later in the movie, but he does make like an important step towards that direction. Like when he's put up to the wall and he has to choose, he does choose good over evil in that instance.
Yeah, I agree. The primary themes are very obvious, right? The depravity of the Nazis, the tyranny of a totalitarian government, and the ruthlessness with which the Jewish people were both treated but also perceived. But there's a lot of secondary themes in this movie. One that stood out for me a lot in the first third of the movie, and it kind of dwindles off as the movie goes on, but it's really evident in the first third of the movie, is agorism. Jeff, are you familiar with agorism?
No.
Jacob, are you familiar with agorism?
Yes.
Yeah, I figured you would be. So agora is the Latin word for market.
Okay.
So if you're agoraphobic, you're afraid of markets. No. If you're agoraphobic, you're afraid of the outside. But agora means kind of the outside, but to the Greeks it meant the markets. And specifically, agorism is a kind of subset of anarchism, where it's a moral imperative to engage in black and gray markets to undermine the state. Okay? A really great example of this. Let's say that you live in a country that borders Argentina.
I live in a country that borders Argentina.
Perfect. You're playing your role perfectly.
Thank you.
And Argentina, it's illegal to do private sales because they're a socialist country.
I know because I live
Nope,
there.
sorry, not Argentina, Venezuela.
Yep.
And so if you live in a border country to Venezuela,
Which I do.
which you do, it's a moral imperative for you to smuggle food in and sell it to Argentinians.
Right, I would never do that.
Of course you would, because it's a moral imperative.
Right.
And in the first third of the movie, we see a lot of black and gray market.
Right.
And not just that we see it, but we see it like as a virtue. These people are doing a good thing, and through this thing, they're able to save a lot of people. Schindler engages in the black markets because it's going to be personally profitable. Stein gives him the accounting, money laundering to do it semi-legitimately, and Pfefferberg provides the goods. And they use that. I thought it was really interesting the way he smuggled in things and then gifted them to the Nazis so that he could get more free labor. And one of the lines he said is, what was it? Why would I hire Poles? Poles cost more. Right? Because he can get the Jews for practically free, and that money goes to the Nazi party instead of the Jews directly. A quick aside, when people talk about the gender pay gap, this is a really good evidence that it doesn't exist, which is that if women could be hired for less than men as like just a flat truth, men would be out of the market because it would just make more sense to hire women.
Yeah. No, that's
End
true.
of rant.
In scene.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important point of it. I mean, you think things like smuggling Jews out of dangerous areas. I think of that scene like where the little boy is helping his friends, the Jewish mother or grandmother and the little girl, and beyond just agorism. I mean, but agorism is a good example of that. Just like that I don't know, the duty to a higher calling than just what the law states.
Right.
There were so many people that just were just following orders, and one of the things that really impacted me was the lectures that Jordan Peterson gave on the Bible. And I remember him talking about people going along with tyranny once. And one of the things he said is that everyone thinks that they're going to be like Oskar Schindler in Nazi Germany, but the truth is 99.99% of you are going to be the ones, if you're not the SS yourself, you are shouting out to the SS in your street, like, here are the Jews, they're right here.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember just so many things like that. I mean, like, there's the scene where people, what's his name, the accountant guy, I always forget his name, Stern. He gets almost deported off to a labor camp because he doesn't have his papers. And I remember, like, then there was the one guy that they had to, that Stern's going around helping all of his Jewish friends to try to get into the, to go work for Schindler by making sure that they're marked as essential workers. And it's like, all this just obviously reminds me of what we were going through over the last few years here in America with the lockdowns and stuff. And heck, there's some places in the world that are still feeling the effects of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's like people at the time thought, they would say like, oh, if you compare this to the Holocaust, you're belittling the Holocaust, you're being anti-Semitic. And I remember at the time being against, like, I pushed back against that. And after watching this movie, I'm like reminded of those times, and I'm like doubling down. Like, no, like it's not belittling to the Holocaust to point out that things like show me your papers and the threat of like vaccine passports and locking people down because they're not essential workers.
Yeah.
Like if anything, it's the exact opposite. Like I said at the beginning, my frustration is we haven't learned our lessons.
Yeah.
Like to truly honor the victims of the Holocaust is to look at those precursors that made it possible and to say never again.
That's absolutely
like, it's not enough to just say never again to
6 million
the slaughter of 6 million Jews, because it's like, that didn't happen overnight. That happened through a series of so many different things that cascaded into the environments and the people that were then in the positions to do that.
Yeah.
So that's something that needs to be talked about as well. I think when we go back and watch this movie, is to remember that, there are precursors to tyranny that need to be opposed as if they were the worst possible tyranny at the end of that, because, it's like once you're at the point where the concentration camps are being built and people are being funneled into it, you're a little late in the game to really be putting an end to that. Like, the longer you wait, the harder it gets.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought up the essential workers thing, because when I was watching it with my wife. When that line came up, I had to pause to avoid just total frustration.
Yeah.
It blew my mind that the U.S. government would have the audacity to use the same term used in Schindler's List. Now, I did fact check. That's not the actual term the Nazis used. I think that's largely irrelevant.
It's the same idea.
Yeah, it's the same idea. Gina Carano, she plays Laura Dune in The Mandalorian. She was fired from her job because she had said during the lockdowns, Jews were beaten in the streets. She didn't say this. She shared a post. Jews were beaten in the streets not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children.
Yeah.
Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews. How is that any different from hating someone for their political views? As Casting Crowns famously saying, it's a slow fade. Now, they were talking about a different thing, but the principle is the same. It doesn't happen immediately, right? You start with this allowable tyranny, and it becomes a monolith. It becomes a Leviathan. It's not overnight.
I'd like to do like a deep study, not because I want this to happen. Obviously, like this was horrendous what I watched in this movie, because I'm clearly not old enough to have gone through this personally or experienced. Like I'd want to know like if there's any similar steps that are happening now, or any current events that are happening now that happened precursor to this that are like, if there's any similar trends. Like just because this is like, you would think we will never get to this again, but like we're in a weird place politically in America that I thought we'd never be in now. So just like, okay, so are we that far off from having something this drastic and this heinous happening again? You know, like
our libertarian and anarchist audience is screaming right now.
I have that turned down.
I mean, honestly, how far off are we from like a, you know, I mean, we were literally so close to legit vaccine passports, and I don't even know if that's necessarily completely off the table. And the more I'm speaking from a libertarian perspective here, but the more we move towards like this ESG stuff and global currency and stuff.
Can you define ESG for my audience?
It's the stuff you add to Chinese food.
That's right.
I forget the actual, what is the
ESG.
actual environmental,
Societal and governance.
right? But your environment, it's basically like scoring you on all these different, you know, basically woke, you know, globalist platitudes.
That's right.
And
BlackRock, though,
and
doing killer on that, so don't worry.
Right, yeah. I heard Raytheon's doing pretty good too.
Yeah. They're blowing up brown kids, but don't worry, it's for a good cause.
Right, yeah. The bombs have rainbows on them, so it's, you know, it's all good. And they power their factories with a little bit of solar power, so that makes it all better. No, but like the more we move towards that kind of thing, the more we're giving the government the power to do these kind of things. And, you know, like whoever's listening, whether you're libertarian or not, whatever your views are, like, do you want the state to have the power to find a group of people, like let's say it's a group of people who, I got to be vague for YouTube reasons, who refuse to get some sort of, you know, medical procedure that they have some qualms about because they don't know if, you know, said medical procedure has been thoroughly tested or not, or that if you know, and even if there is some benefit, that they think there might be some risk, and they want to make their own, you know, risk benefit analysis for what they think is right for them and their family and their children.
You're talking about leg amputation, correct?
Oh yeah, of course. So it's like, so should people be forced to live in a society where if they're going to forego this, you know, this thing, that they are essentially now like on a lower caste in the caste system, and they have to, you know, show their papers, or, you know, God forbid, like, you know, be marked at all times as like, I am, you know, it sounds crazy, but really it's not. I mean, look at what's happening in China right now. Look at what is happening like in Australia and even in parts of Europe right now. Like, to act like that isn't potentially, you know, at least possible in our future here in America.
It's just a couple small steps.
Go back
more.
Yeah. Like go back to 1920s Germany and find people and tell them, you know, in like 20 years time, you're going to be rounding up all your Jewish friends and family and neighbors, and you're going to be sending them off to extermination camps to gas them to death.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm not saying that everyone there loved Jews. There was definitely anti-Semitism then.
And in
people
America,
would have said that
right?
you were crazy.
In every part of the world, there was anti-Semitism.
Right.
On the other hand, if you had told William Wilberforce in the year 1800, hey, I don't know if he was alive then, but, you know, you tell him 20 years earlier, hey, in 20 years, slavery is going to be illegal in England, in all of the Commonwealth, and even in every controlled colony. If you told him that in 20 years, he wouldn't have believed it, right? So just as tyranny can happen very quickly within 20 years, liberty can as well, you know?
Oh yeah. That's it's important to, and that isn't like, this movie is not it's not necessarily like the an obvious white pill, because like so much bad things happen. But
can you define white pill, please?
So
Caucasian pill.
Black pill is sort of all right. So like, if you're using Matrix terminology, there's the obvious ones like red pill and blue pill. Blue pill is like, you just stay in the simulation. You just pretend everything's good. Red pill was kind of acknowledging sort of like, yeah, there's a lot of things messed up in our world. The black pill then refers to like, once you've taken that red pill, being black pilled is kind of like, yeah, things are bad and they're just going to get worse and we're never going to win. And we're just, going to keep spiraling down towards more and more tyranny. White pill is believing that there's at least hope, or that, eventually, all tyrannies have to come to an end. So I think, and I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, but earlier I was quoting Jordan Peterson saying that most of us are not going to be Oskar Schindler in Nazi Germany. But that's mostly a product of, like, his analysis is right on a, broad analytical level of just like social patterns.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we are like biologically or even spiritually predetermined to be that way. Because I also am white pilled, and that more of us could be like that. I mean, it's not like Oskar Schindler was special. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like he was some priest or some amazingly righteous, virtuous person.
In fact, quite the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a deeply flawed person, but all he had to do was, when he was presented with an opportunity to do good in the areas he was given the opportunity to do good, was just act on those things. And it took a little bit of courage. And, I also think that it took a little, I mean, I think also, to put my Christian hat on here for a second, like, another white pill I get from watching this that gives me hope for the future and how things can change is that sometimes God will use like things that we initially mean for evil or we do for selfish reasons, but then those create the circumstances that are used to bring about amazing goods.
Yeah.
Like
story of Joseph.
What?
The story of Joseph. What you intended for evil, God intended for good.
Like the story of Joseph is that's a great example. Oskar Schindler, like, you know what? If he hadn't been greedy at the beginning and tried to accumulate as much wealth as possible, he wouldn't have saved as many people as he did. Like, all the good intentions in the world, if he didn't have all that money and all those resources and had obtained all that political favor, he wouldn't have been in the position to save over 1,000 Jews from the Holocaust. It doesn't really. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we sometimes think that things have to get better in like this utopian fashion, that like suddenly everyone has to become saints overnight and we have to affect this massive, massive scale systemic change overnight, but really it's not even about that. It's like, I think from a Christian perspective and a libertarian perspective, like, no, like, life is always going to be messy and people are always going to be a accumulation of good and evil. But tilting the scales away from totalitarianism and more towards liberty is just about changing, I think, the sort of paradigm in human society that says that we are necessarily enslaved to those sort of like, I don't know, like sinful, selfish impulses. Like, I think sometimes we view things in too much of a black and white lens, where it's like people are either, wholly bad or wholly good, but rather it's like, no, like, you don't have to be the best person in the world, and we don't even not all of us have to be Christian, not all of us have to be libertarian, but we can thwart off tyranny if we just decide that there are, I don't know, some lines that we're not going to, like for Schindler, there were some lines he wasn't willing to cross. And I don't know, he was just, I think there was also that element of exposure, right? Like the element of I don't think he came into things like being this massive Jew hater, but he had just this callousness, you know what I mean? Like, what do I care?
And he also, compared to some of the officers and stuff, like, he definitely didn't have that maliciousness perspective. Like, when he was on the horse with, I believe what was eventually going to be his wife, right? When they're on the horse and he's on the hill and he's watching.
That was not his wife.
That was not, okay. There's a lot of people in this. Yeah.
A lot of pretty women that he spent time with, and that was not
when he was on the horse with that woman, and he was watching townspeople get shot, then be separated. He was watching the scene play out. He felt the weight of that. And this was earlier on in the movie. So, like, there was something about Schindler that was different than Goth, and the fact that like he felt the weight of a person's existence, whether it was because what he could gain from it or what he could there. I mean, he was still Schindler throughout the. He still had his own intentions and stuff. Like he saw the value of life a lot higher than what Goth did.
Absolutely.
And I think that was expressed early on in the movie. Whether or not, like I said, we can go into intentions and stuff, but the movie
it comes up later with the ring that they gift him at the end is inscribed with a Talmudic line, which is
right here. Whoever saves one life saves the entire, right?
Yeah.
Or saves the world entire.
Saves the world entire.
And,
so that's not in Christian scriptures, because that's part of the Talmud, which is it's Jewish scripture that didn't make it into the Old Testament.
Correct.
Basically.
It wasn't in the Pentateuch. Yeah.
It's oral. It's like an oral rabbinic tradition.
Yeah.
Stern, and that was in a discussion with Stern when that line was said. But like the movie in multiple, and I've got the other two facts here. But like there was kind of had this progression of just essentially setting up this butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Of just the power of just when Schindler saved just the 1,100 people, the impact that it had in the future. So if you move a little further in the movie, Stern's talking about the list, and he says this list is an absolute good. This list is life. All around its margins lies the gulf.
Yeah.
So even Stern acknowledged the fact that just this small list, in comparison to all the people that was impacted, this small list, the impact is massive. At the end of the movie, on the title card, and Nelson, you may have some different stats, fact checking this and stuff, but there are fewer than 4,000. This is in '93 when the movie came out. There are fewer than 4,000 Jews left alive today in Poland. There are more than 6,000 descendants of the Schindler Jews.
Yeah.
Like, that's huge.
One thing the movie didn't go into, but it kind of teased in almost a comedic way. As you read there from the end credits, fewer than 4,000 Jews are left alive in Poland today. When they're quote unquote rescued, the soldier says, "You have been liberated by the Soviet army." Now, Jacob, you touched on this early on when you're talking about your family history. For the Jews, liberated by the Soviet army does not mean much.
No.
It got really ugly in Poland for the Jews under the Soviets. And then the soldier himself says, "Don't go east. They hate you there. I wouldn't go west either." Right? Any student of history knows that the Jews suffered horribly under Stalin.
It didn't get better from them after this.
Right? Stalin killed fewer Jews specifically than Hitler, but he killed more people overall than Hitler.
Okay, I did not know that.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Now, I think Hitler killed more as a lot of like Stalin's deaths or like Mao's deaths were like people starving to death, and a lot of Hitler's deaths were just more like, no, we're actually like
we're killing you,
intentionally killing people. But you're correct in terms of like the deaths they're responsible for.
Well, I do want to say footnote on that starving to death. I know that Winograd here is an apologist for Stalin, but I do want to clarify. The Holodomor was very much an intentional thing, right? Like he intentionally starved people to death.
Oh
right?
Yes, I'm not saying it was accidental. I'm just saying, but there's I don't know. I guess to me there's a different depravity to listen. America does the same thing. We do intentional embargoes on regions that lead to the starvation of many people, and I hold our leaders completely responsible for those deaths.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, it's like, I guess the only point I was trying to make was that, like, it's one thing to, because like there's a separation, right? There's one thing to be like, hey, don't let food go in here. It's another thing to be like, take these people and march them into the gas chambers and flip the switch.
That's fair.
And you know what I mean? Like they're just, I'm not saying that one's even better than the other, but they're not the same.
We're not ranking evils, but they are different evils.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things in the movie that speaks to the overall impact that I don't think we can let this episode end without bringing it up is the girl in the red dress.
Yes,
I mean like that is one of like the fact that this movie was in black and white and the only color is Oscar seeing that little girl playing or like walking through the streets in the red dress earlier in the movie and then seeing her corpse being wheeled off later when he's like witnessing the true horror of what Goth and the Nazis are doing. I think part of the problem of like how tyranny happens today is that there is sort of like people are not. We shield ourselves from the consequences of the actions of certain things, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't want to look at the victims. Like people don't like if you go up to them and show them pictures of starving children in Yemen.
Right.
You know what I mean? Especially if you tell them, hey, our government was arming the Saudis who were causing the genocide in Yemen. I mean, which is literally like a modern day Holocaust going on. I mean, and there's so many instances of evils that are happening today, just like, or, at least very similar to the Holocaust. And I guess like what I'm trying to get at is that, like, I'm not saying there isn't good and bad people. Like, obviously Oskar Schindler is a much better person than someone like Goth.
Yeah.
But I also think what enables more people to be good is if they're able to be confronted by the actual human consequences of the things going on around them. And I think the problem is much more a problem of ignorance and apathy than it is of like genuine, evil or disregard for human life. And so that means, to me, that's why I'm partly white-pilled by things in this movie, because it's like, you know what? If people can be shown, things like what, like part of what helps Oskar to go through his transformation is that he sees that he gets to know Jewish people. He gets to see the horrors of the Nazis firsthand.
Absolutely.
There's so many people today that like they just, the people that they hate, they don't see. And the people that are suffering because of different things that they support, they don't see. But it doesn't have to be that way. We have the internet, we have conversations, we have our own local spheres of influence. I'm not saying we need to be abrasive with people, but I think that's one of the things I come away watching this movie being convicted of, is that, like, you know what? Like, it's not enough just to be like, it's yes, there's anti-Semitism, and that's partly what this movie is about, but it's even deeper than that. It's just like when humans are suffering, when humans are, doing evil things, what we have to do is shed light on that, and we have to tell others about it. And, I think that's what I come away. One of my biggest takeaways from the movie is just the importance of shedding light on tyranny and on the things going on around us, and exposing, exposing ourselves to different people and why that's important. It's like, I mean, how much of, like, for example, the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan, the war on terror, was enabled by American ignorance to the Arab and Muslim population. Absolutely. You know what I mean? Like, there was a dehumanizing of those people during the 2000s and 2010s, and that contributed to that 100%. And, that happens in political tribalism. You know what I mean? Like, Democrats, to some extent, dehumanize Republicans, and Republicans do the same back to them. And heck, I'll even call out, like, my fellow libertarians. We can sometimes be a little bit jaunted and do a little bit of that dehumanization towards statists or people of different political affiliations. And I think that, it's, what I want to be clear is, like, it's not about being like, because I hate wokeism. Like, I hate boiling everything down to, it's just prejudice and people being racist and sexist and all that. Like, no, it's not even about those things. It's just about, like, because you can dehumanize people on so many different levels and categories, and it doesn't even have to be an ism. You know what I mean? It can just be an ignorance. It can just be like when you're kind of that effect, like when you're driving a car and people will be just absolutely like nasty to each other and aggressive with each other in ways that they wouldn't do if they were like just walking down the street next to each other. That's the problem. The problem is like, is it's not so much like racism or prejudice. It's that we're isolated. And it's weird because we're in a world with, like, we have all this technology. Like, we're talking over like magic computer beams that are beaming from our computers, right? Like, if you tried describing this to someone 100 years ago, they'd think that you were possessed by a demon. Right. And it's like, I'm talking to someone in my little black box. It's like, okay, crazy person, we're going to take you off to the mental asylum. So, like, we have all this crazy technology, and in some ways we're more connected than ever. But then in some ways we're more isolated from each other than ever. Like, because some of the stuff that happened over the last 3 years, it happened like in your own community. Like, people were snitching on each other. People were at each other's throats. There were riots in cities. Like, all these people living next to each other, and yet they don't know each other. They're isolated from each other. And I think that's one of the things that has to change too, is that we can't be isolated from each other. We have to cross bridges, and we have to, you're less likely to justify or participate in those kind of like aggressions and support those kind of tyrannies if you're aware of it, and if you're no longer able to dehumanize. And like, Oscar couldn't do that. Like, as soon as he had that connection to them, like, again, he's still struggling with it, because he's like, he still cares about money. He still cares about his status and wealth. But he's like, you know what? Like, these are people. Like, that's what compelled him. He's like, I cannot just sit by and watch and just take my money and go, and know that all these people that I've seen and got to know them and their families and all that, and just let them go off to their death. I mean, even to the point that, like, the one train gets accidentally sent to Auschwitz, and he literally moves like heaven and earth to go back there and get them back, like every single one. I mean, that's one of them, we can talk about, like, one of the most powerful scenes in the movie is the end, where he's like, I could have saved one more person. Yeah. He's like crying over, like, he could have sold the car. He could have sold his little gold pin. And that's definitely one of the most powerful scenes. But then the scene where he is, literally dry. I mean, like, that's one of like the darkest parts of the movie, where like you're feeling up, because he's like, wow, he's rescuing all them, and the list has been made and all that. And then you see the people on the train realize, like, oh, we got sent to the wrong place.
And that's true to history as well. They did go to the wrong spot.
Right. And the screen just like depicts like Auschwitz, and like that name just like hits so heavy, and just watching them go through all this, and like, even like watching it for the third time, it's like, I know that he comes and saves them, but like, it is just like, heart gripping just watching that. And then watching how much Schindler, acts, and that's what you do. Like, if he didn't know them, you know what I mean? Like, if they were just, abstract to him, he wouldn't have been compelled, right, to go to such great lengths. And that's part of our problem. It's like, if you tell someone on the street, there's people dying halfway across the world right now, it's too abstract. They will not care. They might say, oh, that's bad, that's too bad, but they're not going to do anything. But if they see, like, oh wow, this is people who are just like me. They have brothers, they have cousins, they have sisters, they have wives, they have, they play games, they tell stories, they eat around meals, they bicker like us. You know what I mean? Like, once you have that, then you get to the point where someone like Oscar Schindler literally dives into like hell on earth to go and save those people that he's grown that connection with.
To be respectful of time and stuff as we're recording this, is there any other major topics we wanted to discuss before we kind of get to the end of our conversation this evening? Just to kind of keep this moving forward.
Yeah, there's one I had. There was a quote with where Schindler's talking to his wife. And he says, there's no way I could have known this before, but there was always something missing in every business I tried. I see now it wasn't me that was failing. It was this thing, this missing thing. Even if I'd known what it was, there's nothing I could have done about it, because you can't create this thing. And it makes all the difference in the world between success and failure. And his wife guesses luck, and he says war. Now, if we discussed in previous episodes, there's that famous quote, war is the health of the state. You look at the companies that do best in times of war. Jacob mentioned earlier Raytheon. Look carefully at the companies that do best in times of war, and be skeptical of that. When political personalities whose positions were funded by companies like Raytheon, companies like I know there's more than one, but I'm blanking. Help me out, Jacob.
Yeah, I always struggle to think of the other ones too.
I know there's more than one. But when these politicians are saying, oh, we really need to be helping out the people in Ukraine, stop and think. Who stands to gain most from funding the war in Ukraine? It's not the Ukrainians. We're barely funding them enough that we just keep this war going. And the result is lots of dead Ukrainians. and padding the wallets of people at Raytheon, at Boeing, at weapons manufacturers.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's, part of what are some of the things that are perpetuating this war in Ukraine? Like, one of the major things is a demonization of the Russian people.
Yeah.
And now listen, I'm not saying that the invasion of Ukraine was justified. I'm not saying Putin is some saint.
Right.
But it's also not fair to compare, Putin's not Adolf Hitler. You know what I mean? Putin's not Stalin. He's not great. I'm not saying that the people of Russia live free and that Putin's not in many ways tyrannical, but he's not people paint him off to be he's literally another Mao or another Hitler or another Stalin, and that's just not accurate. And then there's also a demonization and dehumanization of the Russian people to act that they don't have legitimate concerns for their safety, right? I mean, imagine, I've said this many times, including when I had Scott Horton on my show, but it's imagine if you were living in Texas and you found out Mexico, with the aid of some other foreign country, let's say it was I don't know, China or something, was building missile launchers pretty close to the American border that could be tipped with hydrogen bombs. Would you just sleep soundly at night, being oh, that's cool? They've built 100 of these missile launchers and stuff, but no problem. It's on their territory. It's none of our business. You know what I mean? No, you'd be pretty freaked out by that. I think there's a lot of Russian people who, they're not exactly anti-Ukraine. They're not warmongers, but they're hey, we don't like that NATO's been expanding and that there's been all these, this sort of increasing encroachment of American influence on them. And for all they know, I mean, now they could be subject to some propaganda. We're subject to some propaganda too here in our own country. So it's not that it's not even to say one of the things that I come away from when I watch movies like this and I study history is that there aren't really any saints. And that includes people, and that definitely includes nations and states and governments, right? But at the same time, it's only you wouldn't get Nazi Germany, you wouldn't get all the deaths that Stalin had without the state. We're still going to have problems when we have the state. We're still going to have problems if we had a world without the state. But man, to organize such horror and destruction on a massive scale, it's just not possible. And look at the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. Part of that is you have two groups of people with legitimate security concerns, and how do you handle that? You handle that by sitting down and talking. By saying listen, here are our concerns, here are the things we want. Then the other side says, here are our concerns, here are the things we want. One of the things we both want is probably not to die and not to be engaged in war where our civilians and our military are killing each other, and also we're risking that one of us panics and launches nukes. We don't want that. So what rational, sensible people would be doing, over the last 5-10 years is let's be sitting down and negotiating and taking every possible measure we can to avoid war. And if the American government was a good actor, they'd be doing that same thing. But instead, it's what gets sold is not actual justifications for why a military action has to be made. It's just propaganda about dehumanizing the Russian people and about the exceptionalism of NATO and the American state and Western American hegemony, which honestly it's not that many shades removed from the kind of propaganda that Hitler used to justify the wars of aggression that Nazi Germany engaged in, or that like the Soviet Russia did to justify its expansion and control of the smaller nations and states around them. So, that's it's like people at the time living under Hitler, where it's not like they like knew he was an evil person and looked the other way. No, like they were swept up by his rhetoric, by the belief that like he was acting in their best interests and acting in that he was the good guy in this story. So there's all this just to say that, like I said before, that I think like the underlying lesson here is that the only way that you can cut through propaganda and really stand up to tyranny is to just tell the truth and to shine light on human suffering and on the consequences of tyranny. And we have to do that from a place of like, we're not trying to browbeat people. We're just trying to appeal to their humanity and be like, I know you're better than this. Like, I'm not saying you're perfect, and I'm not saying we're ever going to live in utopia, but we can avoid doing the worst possible things to each other at the very least.
Yeah, no, it's well said.
Before we get to wrap up questions, I got to pee so bad my teeth are floating, so I'll be right back.
All right.
It's fine.
Now a word from our sponsors, Flow Care. I've got nothing. Oh man, there's so many ways you can take this movie with topics of conversation and stuff, like, and just between you and me, just until Nelson gets back, like, there's not too many movies I've watched that have been intentionally about genocide, and in my current household or in my current environment and circle of conversations, like whenever genocide's mentioned, there's always that argument of like, well, the biggest genocide right now is abortion. It's like for me, like, knowing I was watching a movie about genocide, I kind of went into this with this option, like, okay, so how does this relate to us in the abortion fight right now? It's like that was the biggest topic on my mind going into this when it came to current events, was this topic about abortion. And honestly, I couldn't make direct connections, but yeah, just because I was too engulfed by just the actual playing out of these events and stuff. But yeah, so that's another thing that I just kind of is just the topic of abortion, and is that a form of genocide that we're
oh yeah,
that's
absolutely
going on now. So that was kind of one of the preconceived filters I had in my eyes going into this movie, was
it's just a clump of cells. Like, what greater example of dehumanization is there than just to be like, it's just a clump of cells? Well, you know what? I'm just a clump of cells, and you're just a clump of. We're all just clumps of cells, man. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't care. Like, a person is a person. It doesn't matter what race they are. It doesn't matter what sex they are. It doesn't matter what religion they are. It doesn't matter if they believe wacky things that I don't agree with. It doesn't matter how big or small they are. Like, there's this, like, as a Christian, I have certain beliefs about homosexuality, about transgenderism, about sexual promiscuity, about other religions, about, Muslims, and heck, even people who are religiously Jews or Hindu or whatnot. And I have disagreements of opinion, of lifestyle with all those different groups I just mentioned. But you know what I'm not doing? I'm not advocating for the death of those people. I'm not advocating for the dehumanization of those people to being some, like, non-human category. But like, that is so much of what we're facing today. And abortion's like one of the greatest examples of that. I mean, there's so much propaganda that's gone into normalizing abortion in our society. And it is one of the, current ongoing major examples of genocide that we face. Yeah. And again, what's the answer there? Well, part of the problem, part of the solution is we have to expose people to the truth, the facts, and like, even like, hey, this is what an abortion does. Like, you're not just taking a pill and a clump of cells that, just magically disappears. Like, no, like it's actually quite tragic and quite gory. And, by the time people find out that they're pregnant and they undergo an abortion, like there's a living human being, an organism. It's not fully developed yet, but neither is a baby at 12 weeks. Neither is a baby at 16 weeks. Neither is a baby at 23 weeks. It's like, where do we,
things that are
in the minute you casually draw, the minute Yeah, the minute we as a society get comfortable with drawing a line at any point where we say this is a human and this isn't, just based upon like, size or those other categories that I mentioned, we're playing a really dangerous game. And I think that's part of the problem too, is there's so many. I actually think that the dehumanization of just humanity that goes on with something like abortion is one of the things that leads to sort of the callousness that we have towards war and genocide and human suffering as a society, as a species. And that's part, it's like anytime it's one of those, they give the devil his due. Like there are, and Nelson, we're probably more familiar with this. Like there are some libertarians who I find to be kind of annoying, because they share different sensibilities than me.
More libertine than libertarian.
Right, yeah. Or they're more like the blue-pilled, kind of like, we want to be respected by the establishment type libertarians. But one of the things they say it to support things I don't agree with, but the line itself is accurate, is that the violation of someone's liberty anywhere is the violation of people's liberty everywhere. And that's true. Like that is a true statement. Because the minute we're okay with someone's liberty being violated, well, we've just moved that line. That line has moved, for what the Overton window of acceptable tyranny is in society, that line has shifted in the wrong direction. So, listen, it takes effort, but because, it is tough. Like, it's tough to be awake to all the suffering in the world and to not be black-pilled. Like, it takes a little bit of effort to be white-pilled. But, I mean, what's the alternative? Like, I think a movie like Schindler's List is a great, like, someone, like, if you watch that, it's a great opportunity to consider, like, well, do I want to be the kind of person who buries my head in the sand and just looks out for myself? Or, do I want to do what's right? No matter what the cost is.
And the cool thing with the way Schindler did is he used his current situation, his workforce, his established lifestyle, or like the thing that he was already involved with. He used that to make a difference, rather than going, I'm gonna be like crazy. I'm gonna make like these drastic decisions. He's just like, okay, how can I do what I'm already doing and make it for a positive outcome? We see him just make these subtle changes, these just adaptive adjustments that go, now I can continue what I'm doing. I can continue to make a business, but now I'm making a business that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't quit everything. He didn't and not that, we see that positively in other areas. We see people drastically get rid of all their belongings, change their location, move out. Like, we see that, and it's positive and it's functional. But like, we also see, like, within this movie specifically, like, he didn't have to make any drastic decisions. Everything Schindler did was small, minute, conversative decisions that made drastic impact, but they were small and they were, they were intentional.
Absolutely.
Versus just drastic and showy and flashy.
I think that's true, except for when he went after the Jews that got shipped to Auschwitz.
Yeah, that's
the one time he really moves heaven. And like, he literally has to like bribe the official who's like, I could have you arrested for this.
Yeah.
He crossed some boundaries with that.
Yeah. But like, you're right. Everything else, it's just like he's just being very, very subtle, very smart.
How can he make an impact with his day-to-day life?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was just one person.
Yeah, and that was the biggest takeaway for me, because as someone who, I'm a barista, I attend church, like I have a daughter, I'm married, like I've got a lot of these things that I've just my day in, my day out, my normalcy. Like, I think about that a lot, of like, what can I do today that's going to have global impact? What can I do today that's going to impact the town that I live in? Like, what can I do today that's going to impact my church and my community and the students I'm involved with? Like, and this movie just did, like, he put intention to, like, he saw what was happening and he's like, okay, I can adjust this and I can make a difference. And that for me was probably the biggest, like, wow, like that's encouraging in a time of discouraging events. That's encouraging.
Absolutely. There's still, I feel like we've only scratched the surface on this movie, partly as a function of it being a 3-hour movie, but partly as a function of like there's just a lot that this movie touches on briefly, you know, like whether or not slavery is economically efficient, you know, the difference between seduction and rape, you know.
Should all movies be in black and white?
Should all movies be in black and white? Lots of things like that.
Yeah.
So please find us on social media and comment it because we want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts on this movie. But before we wrap up, we do have some closing questions. Jeff, you want to lead us through those?
Yes. So the first one is, and I think we may be all on the same page with this one. Would you guys recommend this movie?
Oh, yeah.
And would you recommend it to anyone?
I would not just recommend it to anyone. In fact, while I was finishing watching this, my 9-year-old daughter came in, and I paused it because there's some definite content
We'll
problems,
get to that in a second.
and not even just like with the depravity of what the Nazis were, but you know, other content issues as well.
Yeah.
So this is not a movie for just anyone, but if you're of a certain age, I mean, I suppose everybody is of a certain age. If you are an adult, I think that this is a must-see.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Jacob.
Yeah, I would even recommend it for, you know, I mean, at parent discretion, teens who are, you know, mature enough to handle it. Like I watched it at 15, and I don't think I was scarred by. I mean, I was impacted, and I think, you know, it's an important. I think the movie is definitely important for. Like, I wouldn't wait. Like I think, yeah, if you're an adult, go watch it. If you're a parent and you have kids and you're wondering if you should show it to them, again, use your discretion. But I would encourage you to, you know, let your teens or even preteens, if you feel that they're mature enough to handle that, you know, have a conversation with them about it beforehand and afterwards, you know. But I think it's a hard movie. It's a heavy movie, but I think that the message that it contains is so important that it's worth that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I have a hard time putting this movie in a category of like entertainment. You know, like
Yeah.
it's not a documentary. Like, I mean, these are all actors and stuff. Like, but like for me, like out of the movies we've watched so far in this podcast, I almost want to put this in a different category of like watch it not for entertainment value, but like for what it can do to you, for you in your perspective of life, from your perspective of politics, and your perspective of how small things can make drastic impact. Like, so I struggle with just saying, "Oh yeah, watch it. It's a great movie." Because like I don't think it's a great movie as far as just watching it and then going to bed.
Yeah.
Like,
This movie made me cry 3 times.
yeah, I wouldn't recommend it just because like I want someone to enjoy their evening. Like,
Right.
like
It's not a date night movie.
hey, good to see you. Hey, watch this movie for a good time. Like for me, like,
Right.
it's the same. I put it in the same category as like the Passion of the Christ, like, which is I've only seen once, and I watched it when I was in junior high. Like for me, like that movie made a huge impact on me just to visualize what my Savior did for me. But like, I don't think
Right.
I'll ever watch that movie again. I mean, I can't say that for sure, but like, I don't know if I'll ever watch this movie again, just because like, I would have a hard time getting in that mindset of like, I'm going to I want to watch it again.
Right.
I don't want to see any of this again. Like this was a very hard movie to comprehend. I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
And I think it's very valuable for people to experience, to tap into what happened, what really happened in our world.
Having that visual really helps make real
Yeah.
what we read about or hear about,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, this, you know, reading the Diary of Anne Frank in high school or whenever I read it, like,
Right.
just like this is a different level of that timepiece, and it was valuable for me, but I don't know if I'd want to go through that again. I think, and I'm not doing this intentionally. I know this is a trope in our podcast, but like, I think I would rather watch A Clockwork Orange before I watch this movie again, just because like I have no emotional attachment to A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
To know that this actually happened, and to know it just took baby steps to get to this type of reality,
Yeah.
that's sobering. I don't.
Yeah, but I think it's something that, I think it's something that at some point everyone, like, I mean, not needs to, like I would compel them, but like I think it's I think it's an important story.
Absolutely.
Like, I mean, I think I wouldn't put it on the level of like reading the Bible, but like whatever the step below that is, it's of that importance. I think to me,
right.
just in terms of the message it delivers.
So
I mean, like, there's certain moments in like cinematic history that are just like they're once in a lifetime kind of like narratives. And it's even hard to find some that compare to this one. Like the one that comes to mind for me that's like it's impactful in a similar way is Darth Vader sacrificing himself to save Luke in Star Wars. Like that's to me like now that's completely fictional, but it's a similar like. Yeah, I know, right?
It's a documentary about a galaxy far, far away and a long time ago.
Right, it says a galaxy a long, long time, so it's obviously true.
We do assume it's fictional, yeah. That's a heavy.
But no, it's like, yeah, it's a heavy moment. There's such depth to that scene and narrative, and it's like I get so bad when people just like share memes. I was like, I've been very careful to like shield my kids from knowing that. That like Luke and Darth Vader are related, let alone that how the Emperor is defeated. Like that's like a story that like once my kids are old enough, like one at a time, like you need to see this and be impacted by it because like and I think Schindler's List is a similar kind of story. Like again, it's not something you watch casually, but I think it's an important story to the human condition and to. I think especially as as a Christian, I think it's an important thing to consume personally. I mean, for me, it's like I don't know. I don't watch. I've only watched the movie 3 times, but I have gone back and watched clips of the movie more often than that, just to kind of be reminded of I don't know, like just like kind of like the feelings that it invokes, and just the absolute weight of the events that happened. I mean, and just how, and then I'll go like every time I've watched it, including this time, I go and like how real were these events? And it's remarkable how very real those events were. Cause like they like you said, they went and fact checked a lot of this.
Yeah.
And there's really no way, like, I mean, there's no disputing any of it.
Yeah.
And the thing that really hits the most is that like Schindler bankrupted himself to save these people.
Yep.
And at the end, that scene where he's just like, I could have done more. It's like, I don't know. I want to live my life in that, like, as much as I can't live every moment that way, but but I want that to be something that is a through line in my life. Yeah. Like, I don't want to get to the end of my life and look back and have that deep regret of like, I could have done more. Like I want to be able to look back and have my kids look at my life and be like, I whether it's
he left it all on the field.
Exactly. It's exactly right. It's like whether it's how I raise my kids, whether it's how I do my job, whether it's what I do with, my activism in libertarianism and in politics, or my walk with God. It's like I want to live with that sense of urgency and not wasting any moments, and also live with that appreciation for human life.
Yeah.
To be like, human life is so sacred and worth so much that it's and none of us live like that. Like, right. I truly think like it's hard for any of us to think that we would literally sacrifice everything we have to even save one person, let alone thousands of people. I mean, and to be in those circumstances. But again, like Oscar, he was in many ways a normal, flawed person. And that's encouragement to me that like, if he was able to do that kind of good and to, again, he doesn't start out that way. He doesn't start out appreciating human life that way. He doesn't start out with that courage, but that grows. You watch that over that long 3-hour movie, you watch that grow and grow and grow and climax. And I don't know. That's something that it's not that I want to watch this movie a lot, but I don't want this to be, I don't ever want to like have that story not be somewhere in the ether of the things that sort of like inform my beliefs and the way I live my life.
Yeah. I do, before we move forward with our wrap-up questions, there's one thing that we've missed that I think is really important. So Goff, we see at the end of the movie, was hanged.
William hunged.
He he was, in the present tense, hanging for his execution.
They struggled to get the stool out from under him.
He was not sentenced to death by the Nuremberg trials because he was not a high-ranking enough Nazi officer. He was instead hung by a war tribunal in Poland. Sentenced to death by a war tribunal in Poland about a year after the Nuremberg trials. And he attempted the Nuremberg defense, which is, I was just following orders, which has not been terribly effective as a criminal defense, but is something that we see even modern show up in discussion and in politics. And it's something that I think that we need to be very... Alarm bells should go off when we hear the words, I was just following orders.
Following the chain of command.
Yeah.
Well, like you brought up my old podcast, Daniel 3, which was inspired by that passage where, I mean, it would have been easy for Meshach, Radshach, and Abednego to be like, you know what, like, yeah, we bowed down to the king. Like, what were we supposed to do? We would have been killed.
That's right.
We would have been thrown in a furnace.
Following orders.
If we didn't do it. Yeah, we were just doing what we were told. But they decided, no, like, we will lay our lives on the line and God will either save us or he won't. You know, Daniel did the same thing with the lion's den. It's so many examples of people in the Bible and throughout history that decided, like, you know what? No, like, I'm going to do what's right, regardless of what everyone around me is telling me.
That's right.
Regardless of what threats the state or kings or anyone else makes of me.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Next question here. Which this was an easy one. Would you guys?
I'm sorry. That handbrake change killed me.
Skirt. Would you guys change the rating? I feel like this one's an easy one.
It was rated R, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, there's no way.
I'd almost go in our NC-17 or whatever that rating is. Like, I'd almost go beyond R.
It's absolutely R. I think that this movie does have some things in it that it lends to its rating that aren't necessary, but at the same time, I don't think you can make this movie without making it rated R.
The violence, the grotesque nudity, the actual sexualization of the nudity is minimal. There's one scene where it's sexual, maybe two scenes.
There's a handful.
But most of it is just the dehumanizing of these Jews.
Nudity for humiliation, not for sexuality.
Right. So, like, I mean, it wasn't nudity in the sexual sense. Not that that's any better, but like, but yeah. So nudity, violence. The language was minimal, but
was it, or did we just get used to it very quickly?
It was minimal. It was mild in the IMDb sense.
Okay.
It was not severe, where the violence and the nudity was severe.
Yeah. And I think I think the severe nudity, the sexual nudity, we probably could have done without and still get the same message.
Right, correct.
But I think the humiliation nudity and the violence, I think, are absolutely essential to the... It
made sense.
Yeah, I think they're essential to the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you guys just said. I think I would take out the sexual nudity, but everything else I'd probably leave the way it is.
Yeah. And there's even male full frontal nudity.
Correct.
If somehow you've gotten to this point of the episode and you've not already seen the movie, warning.
Male and female frontal.
Yeah.
Frontal.
You will
nudity.
see some schlong.
Yeah. I like that you use the Yiddish for it.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Staying relevant. Third question. Third of four. Has it aged well? Has this movie stood the test of time cinematically?
As we've discussed in previous episodes, an advantage of doing period pieces is that it kind of allows itself to step outside of that. Also, the choice to put it in black and white, where there's three scenes that have color, right? Which is the opening scene, which is a Shabbat ceremony for the second day of Hanukkah. Then you've got the girl in red, and then later on when they're having another Shabbat scene, the use of color allows it to kind of sidestep again some of the dating that might happen with mid-90s photography. Mm-hmm. I think it aged very well.
Yeah, and to compare, like this came out in 93. Groundhog Day also came out in 93. So like,
oh really?
Yeah. So cinematic, like as far as cinema movies goes, like color was very much vibrant and And yeah,
Mhm.
this
Man, can you imagine going to the movies in '93 and be like, one week we're like, hey, let's go watch Groundhog Day, and then the next week you're like, let's go watch Schindler's List. Like,
date night.
Date night.
gosh,
Yeah. Oh, they're all sold out for Groundhog Day. Well, let's see Schindler's List. I've heard great things.
Yeah. See, I think it's a foreign film. Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of those black and white art house films.
Yeah. Oh man.
I didn't check on this. Did the movie originally air in theaters at 3 hours long?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's look that up.
Let's look it up. Yeah, let's. I mean, as Nelson's typing this in, I do believe this is the theatrical cut, though. Like I didn't see anywhere where this is like an extended version, or I think there's just one version of this movie.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to be sure that like it released that way because it's just very long, and especially like for a movie that old to be that long.
Yeah, it did. The theatrical release,
Which is just
was
because like, remember when like Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame came out, they were all making a big deal about that movie, which was like what 2.5 hours long,
Yeah.
or maybe might have been 3 hours. But like Schindler's List did it back in '93, but that's a year after I was born.
Yeah.
we've got a short attention span.
I do. I'm bringing up the facts right now. I think this is just relevant as far as time period goes. As I bring this up here, directed by Steven Spielberg, and
Executive producer of Animaniacs.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, so around the time, let me jump here, 93 here as it's loading. Just to give you a timeline as far as what was going on for Steven Spielberg at the time. So in '91, he did Hook with Robin Williams. He did Jurassic Park the same year as this movie.
And both of those from the top 250.
Correct. Jurassic Park and Schindler's List both in the top 250. After Schindler's List, then he went on to do the second Jurassic Park. And then in '97, the same year as the second Jurassic Park, 4 years later from Schindler's List, he did Amistad, which is also another, I believe, historical set piece. I have not seen Amistad.
And then the year following, Saving Private Ryan, another top 250.
I'm familiar with the Amistad soundtrack. I'm actually not familiar with the story.
For our audience members that have come here from the Christians for Liberty podcast, in the future, we're expecting to have Doug on to do his favorite movie, Jurassic Park, and we're anticipating that. And that came out the same year as Schindler's List. Two movies couldn't be more tonally different, but also two movies that very clearly the director, Steven Spielberg in this case, very committed to capturing a specific like theme and feeling.
Right.
Very interesting.
I had heard rumors that like, in fact, check me if I'm wrong in the comments and stuff. Like this is just coming from dialogue here. But like, this movie was one that Spielberg wanted to do, regardless of who was not involved.
That's right.
So the company that he was working with, I think, said like, essentially kind of made a deal like, if you do this one for me, which I believe was the Jurassic Park film.
Okay.
If you can run with the Jurassic Park, we'll allow you to do the one you want to run with. Again, fact check me. If it wasn't Jurassic Park, I do believe that he kind of bartered with him because obviously this one is a temperamental, it's a hot topic movie.
Yeah.
I think he kind of had
Produced
to barter.
by Hot Topic.
Yeah. The clothing company. I think he had to barter a little bit to get this movie functional.
It's also probably one of the few, like in terms of all the movies I can think of by Steven, it's one of the movies that features like the least amount of music.
Yeah.
Like there's something like for 3 hours of movie, there's definitely like there's the main theme that plays at certain times.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a movie that's devoid of music, but compared to like think of Jurassic Park, like that movie is like riddled with all sorts of like music and you know, even just like a little bit of like background music to like enhance certain scenes.
Right.
And there's so much of Schindler's List that's just like, you know, there's just no music in the background.
Or it's just that I know there's the solo violinist.
Yes.
She's and then they gave her name at the end of the movie. She essentially is like the musical narrator. Like she is giving the just that single sound of violin throughout the movie. So there is music, but it is subtle compared to other cinematic experiences. Yeah.
You know, I thought we wouldn't get to it, and I know we're borrowing a lot of your time here, Jacob, and I appreciate you being here. You brought up the music. There's two specific songs that I thought were very thematically important.
Both
One of
by
them,
AC/DC, right?
that's right, Highway to Hell and Back in Black. So the first one was there's one song that repeats 3 or 4 times, and it's called Jerusalem of Gold. It eventually became the Israeli national anthem, or it's nationally significant. I
Wow.
can't remember which. And I've got the English translation because it's actually sang in Hebrew. So the mountain air is clear as wine, and the scent of pines is carried on the breeze of twilight with the sound of bells. And in the slumber of tree and stone, captured in her dream, the city that sits solitary, and in its midst is a wall, Jerusalem of gold and of light and of bronze. I am the lute for all your songs. This song is played in a few different points, and each time it's like there's a significance of hope. Those 3 times are at the beginning, when there's a in color Shabbat.
Okay.
Later, when there's a girl in red. And later, when there's another Shabbat scene, and all that's lit, the only color is the candle light. So the color, the few times color shows up in the movie is accompanied by this song. And it's very much a hope for a future place, a Jerusalem of gold. The other song that really struck me as particularly emotionally significant is when they're in the concentration camp and all of the kids are marching and singing a song and climbing into trucks.
Oh, gosh.
The song they're singing, do you know what that song is?
I don't.
That was the national anthem of the Nazi Party. I'm glad you don't recognize it off the top of your head. I had to look it up. But there's something to that kind of speaks to the indoctrination, right? We talked about how... You know, as Jordan Peterson said, chances are you're not going to be Oskar Schindler. You're going to be one of the millions of German people that support the Nazi Party.
Right.
Even within the Jews, we saw people that were operating as police officers. We saw indoctrinated children singing the Nazi anthem. You know, it's way more... Propaganda is way more effective and complicated than people realize.
There was many pivotal moments, but the kids getting on the trucks was...
That was the second time I cried during the movie.
Gosh.
And that was ugly crying.
Man, that... Such a heavy movie. Well, last question.
Moving forward with these wrap-up questions.
So, the last question here, and Jacob, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been incredible. Would this be in your personal top 250? Which, again,
for you, I think we know the answer.
This is a very blanket, generic question, but like, would you guys put this in your top 250? Personal top 250?
Oh, yeah. It'd be in my top 5 easily.
Okay.
If it's not number 1, it's at least in the top 5, top 3.
Okay.
Yeah. Oftentimes when I'm thinking about that question, I'm thinking movies that I'd happily watch over and over again.
Entertainment value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for this one, like, it's been 10 years since I saw it. I would happily go another 10 years, but at the same time, it's such a significant movie. And not just significant, but like well done.
Yeah.
You know, it's a beautiful movie. The dialogue is incredible. The cinematography is incredible. Yeah, everything's intentional. It's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah.
And for that, I would easily put it in my top 250.
Yeah. This would be in my top 250, but assuming that I may never watch it again.
Exactly.
Bizarrely. But the importance of this film would make it in my top 250.
Yeah, and not important.
But like how many? Like,
go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's like you bring up the aspect of like, would you watch it again? It's like, well, some of my favorite books are books I've only read once.
Right.
I mean, like, how many times are you going to read Lord of the Rings or like the Odyssey? Like, you know, I mean, maybe more than once, but not like something you go and pick up over and over again. Like, those are long, difficult reads. But you know, sometimes it's like the stories. You know, the story is so good that once is enough, and it you know, it sits with you your whole life.
Absolutely,
that's huge. Yeah,
couldn't put it better.
Well, as far as movie discussion, I think that's it for me. Nelson, do you have any other, or Nelson or Jacob, do you guys have any other final thoughts you'd like to add as before we get into the final wrap up of this?
There's further wrap up. I thought we were in the final.
I want to give Jacob a chance to plug.
I want to
give Jacob a chance to plug anything he wants to.
Oh yeah, that was going to be my final thing. Is Jacob, if people who are unfamiliar with you want to find more of you, where should they go? What should I link below?
Sure. Well, first of all, I really appreciate you guys having me on to talk about this. And this movie is very important to me for kind of all the reasons I've already stated, and so it was it means a lot to come on and talk about it, and it was also it was also good because it was like watching this movie now with everything going on. It just reignited that sort of spark in me that on those different themes that we talked about. So it was good to have a conversation about it, and it was also good that it forced me to watch it again. And I'm glad that I did watch it again, because I was able to take away so much more from that movie than I did when I watched it initially as a kid, or as a young adult. As for where you can find me, so on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @Biblical Anarchy, and if you want to interact with me or follow my, see any updates or things I post, that's where I'm the most active. I'm also on Facebook, but let's just face it, Facebook is dead, and if you use it, you're a loser. No, I'm just kidding.
How dare you come at me like that?
Facebook is our biggest sponsor here, Jacob. So.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Easy, buddy.
I'm a Twitter absolutist.
Yeah, Jacob's very active on Twitter. And his stuff is incredible.
And you can if you want to check out the podcast, you can go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com. You can also search for Biblical Anarchy Podcast on really any podcatcher, YouTube, Odyssey, things like that, and find me there as well. And if you want to look at my personal website is daniel318.com if you want to check that out as well. And that's I think that's
Jacob, are your the podcasts you just recently retired, are those episodes still available to listen? Okay. So
yep, those are still. So my old podcast, the Daniel 3 podcast, is still up for posterity's sake on posterity's sake rather on podcatchers. I did, posterity's sake. I did take a lot of them down on YouTube, mainly for fear of censorship, because YouTube has been going around and putting strikes in old videos. So I took down a lot of them and just left up some of the really good ones. Or less controversial ones. But you can see all of the old episodes if you go to, you can go to daniel318.com. That'll have all those old episodes there. And they're also still all up on podcatchers and things like that.
And all of those things linked below in the show notes.
Yep. Jacob, it's been wonderful having you. We appreciate your perspective on this, and just this discussion was very valuable. And I'm grateful for this conversation. So I believe that's it. I think we've got to all we could today in this episode, but
without going for another 3 hours.
Yeah. But thank you so much for being on the show. We are grateful for your connection here and your perspective.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Next time, join us for Star Wars: A New Hope. Is that right?
Yeah. Episode 4.
Episode 4. Star Wars.
Episode 4.
Yeah. So there's controversy over this. Is it Star Wars? Is it Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope?
Is it Star Wars Episode 1: A New Hope? Because originally it was Episode 1.
Yeah.
It's all over.
We don't take a position on it, but we will be watching that movie.
It's the Star Wars that identifies as
Star Wars that identifies as Episode 4: A New Hope. Thank you so much for your time, Jacob. Thanks again. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening. We had a great time putting this together for you.
To join the conversation, find us on Facebook and Instagram at Silver Screen Biases.
And on Twitter at Screen Biases.
We believe in value for value, so if you found value in our show, we ask you to consider supporting us.
Links to our social media and support can be found in the show notes.